The year is 1568. A raw wind, sharp with the threat of snow, whipped across the desolate moors of northern England, biting through the heavy woolen cloak Mary Stuart clutched around herself. The small party, depleted by desertion and weariness, huddled closer as they crested a small rise, revealing the grim outline of Carlisle Castle in the distance. It was a stark, imposing structure of grey stone, a world away from the verdant hills of Scotland she had so reluctantly left behind. Only days ago, she had commanded armies, held court in opulent palaces, and been the undisputed Queen of Scotland. Now she was a fugitive, seeking refuge across a border she had once considered an enemy line. Hope, which had burned so brightly in the immediate aftermath of her escape from Loch Leven Castle and the disastrous Battle of Langside, had begun to dwindle with each passing mile. The faces of her loyal retainers, once filled with fervor and conviction, now reflected the gnawing fear that mirrored her own. She had gambled everything on this journey south, placing her fate in the hands of her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I of England. A dangerous gamble, perhaps, but one she believed necessary to reclaim her throne and secure the future of her infant son, James. As they approached the castle gates, Mary straightened her shoulders, forcing a regal composure despite the bone-chilling wind and the nagging anxiety that gnawed at her insides. She must project strength, confidence, and above all, innocence. Elizabeth needed to see her not as a threat, but as a fellow sovereign in need of assistance, a queen unjustly deposed by rebellious subjects. Sir Richard Lowther, the deputy warden of the West Marches, greeted them with a cautious formality that did little to ease Mary's apprehension. He offered the customary courtesies, but his eyes, cold and assessing, betrayed a deeper wariness. Carlisle Castle, he informed her, was at her disposal, a place where she could rest and recover while Elizabeth considered her request. The words were polite, but the underlying message was clear. She was under guard. The apartments assigned to Mary were spacious enough but undeniably austere. Thick stone walls, small barred windows, and the constant presence of armed guards created an atmosphere more akin to imprisonment than sanctuary. Still, Mary refused to allow despair to take root. She unpacked her meager belongings, arranging them with meticulous care, as if to assert some semblance of control over her surroundings. She summoned her ladies-in-waiting, reminding them of the importance of maintaining appearances, of projecting an air of unwavering loyalty and optimism. The days that followed were a blur of diplomatic maneuvering and anxious waiting. Mary penned eloquent letters to Elizabeth, reminding her of their shared kinship, their common cause as queens, and the injustice of her current predicament. She recounted the events that had led to her downfall, the murder of her husband, Lord Darnley, the machinations of her rebellious lords, and the forced abdication in favor of her infant son, painting herself as a victim of circumstance, a woman betrayed by those she had trusted. She also recognized the need to cultivate support within the English court. Her beauty, charm, and considerable intellect had always been her most potent weapons. She engaged in lively conversations with the English officials who visited her, skillfully steering the discussions towards her own plight, subtly appealing to their sense of chivalry and justice. She learned quickly who might be sympathetic to her cause and who remained firmly in Elizabeth's camp. The Queen of Scots was known for her charisma, and she used it to its fullest effect. One of the first to visit was Sir Francis Knollys, a staunch Protestant and a close advisor to Elizabeth. He was assigned to act as Mary's custodian and to report back on her activities and sentiments. Mary, sensing his skepticism, approached him with disarming candor. She engaged him in theological discussions, displaying a remarkable knowledge of Scripture and a willingness to engage in reasoned debate. She spoke of her desire for religious tolerance and her commitment to maintaining peace between England and Scotland. Knollys, though initially wary, found himself impressed by Mary's intelligence and grace. He acknowledged her political skill. In his letters to Elizabeth, he offered a balanced assessment, noting Mary's undeniable charm and persuasive abilities, while also cautioning against underestimating her ambition and her unwavering belief in her own divine right to rule. As weeks turned into months, the initial hopefulness that had sustained Mary began to erode. Elizabeth remained frustratingly non-committal. While she expressed sympathy for Mary's plight, she also insisted on a thorough investigation into the circumstances surrounding Darnley's murder and the allegations of Mary's involvement with the Earl of Bothwell. This investigation, Elizabeth assured her, was necessary to determine whether Mary was truly fit to be restored to the Scottish throne. But Mary suspected that the investigation was merely a delaying tactic, a way for Elizabeth to keep her in limbo while she assessed the political landscape and weighed the potential consequences of either restoring her to power or allowing her to remain in England. The longer she remained in England, the more dangerous she became. She was a constant reminder of Elizabeth's own precarious claim to the throne. As a Catholic with a strong hereditary claim, Mary represented a potential rallying point for English Catholics who still regarded Elizabeth as illegitimate. The English court, Mary discovered, was a viper's nest of intrigue and ambition. William Cecil, Elizabeth's principal secretary, emerged as her most formidable opponent. A shrewd and ruthless politician, Cecil viewed Mary as a grave threat to England's security and to Elizabeth's reign. He actively fostered suspicion and paranoia, subtly poisoning the minds of Elizabeth and her advisers against Mary. He subtly pushed for a policy of containment, ensuring that Mary remained under strict surveillance and that her opportunities to communicate with the outside world were severely limited. Mary understood that her every word, every action was being scrutinized, analyzed, and potentially twisted against her. She had to be constantly vigilant, careful not to give her enemies any ammunition to use against her. She relied heavily on her small circle of loyal retainers, using them to gather information, to relay messages, and to maintain contact with her supporters in Scotland and France. Among her most trusted advisers was Lord Herries, a Scottish nobleman who had accompanied her to England. Herries acted as her chief negotiator, pleading her case to Elizabeth and her counselors, and seeking to secure more favorable terms for her confinement. But even Herries' efforts were largely in vain. Elizabeth remained unmoved, her decisions driven by political expediency rather than personal compassion. One cold afternoon, while confined in Carlisle Castle, Mary sat at a small writing desk, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows across the stone walls. She was drafting a letter to the Duke of Norfolk, a powerful English nobleman who she hoped might become a sympathetic ally. Norfolk, a Protestant, was known to harbor ambitions of his own, and Mary believed that she could potentially use him to further her own cause. She chose her words with meticulous care, subtly hinting at the possibility of a marriage alliance, while also emphasizing her commitment to maintaining peace and stability between England and Scotland. As she paused, quill hovering over the parchment, Mary reflected on the importance of maintaining connections, of sharing her story, of ensuring that her voice was not silenced by her captors. Communication, she knew, was her only weapon against the forces arrayed against her. The ability to reach out, to influence opinions, to rally support, these were her lifelines in this increasingly precarious situation. She dipped her quill back into the ink, a flicker of determination in her eyes. The world needed to know what was happening to her. Others could help spread awareness of her plight, to champion her cause, to pressure Elizabeth to act justly. Just as she relied on her messengers and letters, perhaps others, even those beyond the castle walls, could play their part in ensuring her story was heard. The weeks continued to drag on, each one indistinguishable from the last. The initial courtesies gradually faded away, replaced by a growing sense of isolation and confinement. Mary was no longer treated as a guest, but as a prisoner. Her movements were restricted, her correspondence was intercepted, and her visitors were carefully screened. The shift in atmosphere was subtle but unmistakable. The guards became less attentive, their expressions less respectful. The food served in her apartments became coarser, the service less prompt. The visits from English officials became less frequent, their tone more formal and detached. Mary realized that she was slowly being erased from the political landscape, relegated to the status of a forgotten queen, a pawn in a game played by others. One evening, as she gazed out of her small barred window at the darkening sky, Mary felt a wave of despair wash over her. The wind howled through the battlements, a mournful sound that seemed to echo the turmoil in her own heart. She had come to England seeking refuge, seeking justice, seeking to reclaim her throne. Instead, she had found only captivity, suspicion, and betrayal. The hope that had once burned so brightly had now dwindled to a flickering ember, threatened by the cold winds of political reality. She knew she could not afford to succumb to despair. She had a son to protect, a kingdom to reclaim, and a destiny to fulfill. She would continue to fight, to plot, to maneuver, to use every weapon at her disposal to secure her freedom and regain her rightful place in the world. But as she turned away from the window, a chilling thought crept into her mind. What if her enemies were already one step ahead? What if her fate was already sealed? The days turned into weeks and the weeks into months. Carlisle Castle, with its cold stone walls and watchful guards, became Mary's world. The vibrant Queen of Scotland, accustomed to the grandeur and bustle of royal life, was now a prisoner, her days filled with a monotonous routine of writing letters, praying, and engaging in endless political chess with her captors. One evening, while she was playing chess with one of her ladies-in-waiting, a messenger arrived with a letter from Elizabeth. Mary's heart leapt with anticipation. Perhaps this was the moment she had been waiting for. The moment when Elizabeth would finally declare her support and offer to help her reclaim her throne. But as she read the letter, her face fell. Elizabeth, while expressing continued sympathy for her plight, informed her that the investigation into the Darnley murder was proving to be more complex than initially anticipated. Further inquiries were necessary, and until those inquiries were completed, Elizabeth could not make any firm commitments. In the meantime, for her own safety and security, Mary would be moved to a more secure location further south, away from the Scottish border. Mary's blood ran cold. She knew what that meant. She was being moved deeper into England, further away from any hope of rescue or escape. She was being placed under tighter control, her fate sealed by Elizabeth's indecision and Cecil's machinations. The game, she realized, was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning, and the stakes were higher than ever before. The move south was a grim journey, a slow procession through the bleak English countryside. Mary was escorted by a heavily armed guard, her every movement watched, her every word overheard. She passed through towns and villages, but she was kept isolated from the local population, prevented from making contact with potential sympathizers. Eventually, she arrived at Bolton Castle, a more imposing and isolated fortress than Carlisle. Here, the restrictions on her freedom were even greater. She was confined to a small suite of rooms, her servants were subjected to rigorous interrogations, and her correspondence was heavily censored. She felt like a bird trapped in a gilded cage, her wings clipped, her spirit slowly being broken. Despite the increasingly oppressive conditions, Mary refused to give up hope. She continued to write letters, to plot and scheme, to cultivate potential allies. She knew that her survival depended on her ability to maintain her presence on the political stage, to remind the world that she was still a queen, still a force to be reckoned with. She focused on cultivating a relationship with her custodian, Sir Francis Knollys, recognizing him as a man of principle and integrity, despite his staunch Protestant beliefs. She engaged him in intellectual debates, discussing theology, politics, and philosophy. She appealed to his sense of justice and fair play, arguing that she was being unfairly treated and that her case deserved a fair hearing. Knollys, though cautious and circumspect, found himself increasingly drawn to Mary's intelligence and charm. He admired her resilience and her unwavering belief in her own divine right to rule. In his letters to Elizabeth, he continued to provide balanced assessments, acknowledging Mary's strengths and weaknesses, while also emphasizing the need for a just and equitable resolution to her situation. But Elizabeth remained unmoved. She was caught between conflicting pressures, the demands of her Protestant advisors, the threat of Catholic rebellion, and the potential consequences of alienating either France or Scotland. She hesitated to make a decisive move, preferring to maintain the status quo, keeping Mary confined but alive, a constant source of anxiety, but also a useful bargaining chip in the complex game of European politics. As the months turned into years, Mary's captivity became a defining feature of her life. She adapted to the monotonous routine, finding solace in her faith, in her books, and in the company of her loyal retainers. But beneath the surface she seethed with frustration and resentment. She longed for freedom, for power, for the opportunity to reclaim her rightful place in the world. One evening, as she sat alone in her chamber, writing in her diary, Mary paused and looked out of the window. The sky was a deep velvety blue, studded with countless stars. She felt a sense of profound loneliness, a sense of being cut off from the world, trapped in a prison of her own making. But then she straightened her shoulders, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. She was a queen, anointed by God, and she would not allow her enemies to break her spirit. She would continue to fight, to plot, to scheme until the day she regained her freedom and her throne. Her story was far from over. The most dangerous part was just beginning. The fragile hope that had flickered within Mary Queen of Scots began to dim as the wheels of English justice, or what passed for it, began to turn. The cordial facade Elizabeth had presented upon Mary's arrival was slowly chipped away, revealing the steely resolve of a queen who saw a dangerous rival, not a distressed cousin. The investigation, promised as a means to clarify the situation in Scotland and potentially restore Mary to her throne, morphed into something far more ominous. a trial in all but name, Elizabeth announced the commencement of an official inquiry into the circumstances surrounding Lord Darnley's death and the subsequent events leading to Mary's abdication. Commissioners were appointed, ostensibly impartial, but carefully selected for their loyalty to the English crown and their deep-seated suspicion of the Scottish Queen. The location chosen for this inquiry, York, was far enough from London to keep Mary isolated, but close enough for Elizabeth to maintain control. Mary, initially believing this to be a genuine opportunity to plead her case, prepared to present her version of events. She painstakingly recounted the conspiracies, the betrayals, and the violence that had plagued her reign. She emphasized the constant threats to her life and the manipulations of her half-brother, the Earl of Moray, and his faction. She portrayed Bothwell as a desperate man acting out of love and loyalty, not as a master manipulator driving a wedge between her and her subjects. She painted a picture of a queen beset on all sides by enemies, driven to make difficult choices in the face of overwhelming odds. However, the atmosphere in York was far from receptive. The English commissioners, led by the Duke of Norfolk, listened with polite detachment, their faces betraying little of their thoughts. William Cecil, Elizabeth's principal secretary, and the true architect of England's policy towards Scotland, remained largely in the background, pulling strings and whispering counsel into the ears of the commissioners. His presence alone was enough to sow doubt in Mary's mind. The pivotal moment of the York Conference arrived with the presentation of the infamous casket letters. These letters, purportedly written by Mary to Bothwell in the lead up to Darnley's murder, were produced by Moray as irrefutable proof of her guilt. The letters detailed a passionate and illicit affair, implicating Mary directly in the plot to assassinate her husband. Upon seeing the letters, Mary was consumed with a mixture of shock and outrage. She vehemently denied their authenticity, declaring them to be forgeries concocted by her enemies to destroy her reputation and her claim to the English throne. She pointed to inconsistencies in the handwriting, discrepancies in the style, and the lack of original documents. She argued that the letters were a deliberate attempt to frame her and to justify her forced abdication. "These letters are false, fabricated by those who seek to usurp my throne and besmirch my name," she declared, her voice echoing through the chamber. "I demand to see the originals, to have them examined by impartial experts. I will prove to you that they are nothing more than vile lies." Her pleas, however, fell on deaf ears. The commissioners, under Cecil's direction, refused to allow her access to the original letters, claiming that they were too sensitive to be exposed to further scrutiny. They presented only copies, which Mary argued were easily manipulated and could not be relied upon as evidence. Mary's refusal to acknowledge the authority of the English court to judge her further complicated the situation. As a sovereign queen, she argued, she was only accountable to God. She refused to submit to a trial that she believed was inherently biased against her. This defiance, while understandable, played directly into the hands of her enemies. It allowed them to portray her as arrogant and uncooperative, unwilling to face the truth. The investigation dragged on for weeks, with Mary becoming increasingly frustrated and disillusioned. She realized that the inquiry was not about finding the truth, but about justifying Elizabeth's predetermined course of action. She was not being treated as a guest or a fellow monarch, but as a prisoner, held captive in a gilded cage. As the York Conference drew to a close, Elizabeth was faced with a difficult decision. To condemn Mary outright would be to risk war with Scotland and to alienate Catholic powers across Europe. To acquit her would be to acknowledge her claim to the English throne and to embolden her supporters within England. She chose a middle ground, a decision that satisfied no one but served her own political interests. Elizabeth refused to issue a formal verdict, neither convicting nor acquitting Mary. Instead, she declared that the investigation had raised serious questions about Mary's involvement in Darnley's murder, but that there was insufficient evidence to justify a formal indictment. This ambiguous outcome effectively left Mary in limbo, neither free nor formally imprisoned, but under strict surveillance, and denied the opportunity to return to Scotland. Mary was moved from York to Bolton Castle, a more secure and isolated location. Her household was reduced and her movements were carefully monitored. She was no longer a guest but a captive, albeit one treated with a semblance of royal dignity. The illusion of hospitality had been shattered, replaced by the cold reality of imprisonment. Despite her confinement, Mary refused to give up hope. She maintained contact with her supporters in Scotland and England, sending coded messages and clandestine letters. She plotted escape attempts, some audacious, others more subtle, all ultimately unsuccessful. She continued to assert her innocence and to lobby for her release, appealing to Elizabeth's sense of justice and to their shared kinship. However, Mary's very existence continued to pose a threat to Elizabeth's reign. Catholic nobles within England viewed Mary as the rightful heir to the English throne, and they began to plot in her name. The Duke of Norfolk, initially one of the commissioners investigating Mary, became entangled in a conspiracy to marry her and overthrow Elizabeth. Norfolk, a man of ambition and vanity, saw in Mary a path to power and influence. He believed that by marrying her, he could unite the kingdoms of England and Scotland and restore Catholicism to England. He secretly corresponded with Mary, pledging his support and promising to help her escape. However, Norfolk's plot was discovered by Cecil, who had been watching him closely. Norfolk was arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London. His involvement in the conspiracy served to further incriminate Mary and to deepen Elizabeth's suspicions. The exposure of the Norfolk plot marked a turning point in Mary's captivity. Elizabeth realized that Mary was not just a potential rival, but a dangerous catalyst for rebellion. She could no longer afford to treat her with leniency, or to hope that she would simply fade away. From that moment forward, Mary's confinement became stricter, her communications more tightly controlled, and her isolation more complete. She was moved from one castle to another, each more remote and more heavily guarded than the last. Her servants were interrogated, her letters were intercepted, and her every move was scrutinized. Despite the increasing restrictions, Mary remained defiant. She continued to plot and scheme, to write letters and send messages, to cling to the hope that one day she would be free. She saw herself as a queen unjustly imprisoned, a victim of political intrigue and religious persecution. She believed that God would ultimately deliver her from her enemies and restore her to her rightful place. However, as the years passed, Mary's hope began to dwindle. The plots and conspiracies in her name continued, but they were increasingly desperate and ill-conceived. Each failed attempt only served to tighten the noose around her neck. The Ridolfi plot, another scheme to overthrow Elizabeth and replace her with Mary, was uncovered in 1571. This plot, orchestrated by an Italian banker named Roberto di Ridolfi, involved Spanish troops invading England and a coordinated uprising by English Catholics. The plot was foiled by Cecil's intelligence network, and many of the conspirators were arrested and executed. The Ridolfi plot further solidified Elizabeth's resolve to keep Mary under close guard. She realized that Mary was a constant source of danger, a rallying point for those who sought to undermine her authority and destabilize her kingdom. As Mary's world narrowed, her health began to decline. The years of confinement, the constant stress, and the lack of freedom took their toll. She suffered from chronic illnesses, including rheumatism and depression. She grew increasingly isolated and despondent. Despite her physical and emotional suffering, Mary remained determined to protect her son James. She understood that his claim to the Scottish throne and potentially the English throne depended on her survival. She wrote letters to him, advising him on matters of state and urging him to remain loyal to the Catholic faith. However, Mary's influence over James was limited. He was raised in Scotland under the guardianship of Protestant regents, who sought to distance him from his mother and to indoctrinate him with their own religious beliefs. James, eager to secure his own position, gradually distanced himself from Mary and sought to cultivate a good relationship with Elizabeth. Mary's hopes for a restoration of her power in Scotland faded as James grew older and more independent. She realized that her son was unlikely to come to her rescue, and that her fate was ultimately in the hands of Elizabeth. The years of captivity weighed heavily on Mary, but they also forged within her a steely resolve. She learned to navigate the treacherous currents of English politics, to manipulate her captors, and to maintain her dignity in the face of adversity. She became a master of intrigue, a skilled diplomat, and a formidable opponent. However, Mary's skills and determination were ultimately no match for the power of the English crown. Elizabeth, driven by a combination of fear, ambition, and religious zeal, was determined to eliminate the threat that Mary posed. The final act of Mary's tragic story began with the discovery of the Babington plot in 1586. This plot, named after Anthony Babington, an English Catholic who sought to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the English throne, provided the final damning evidence that Elizabeth needed to justify Mary's execution. Babington, a young and idealistic nobleman, believed that Mary was the rightful Queen of England and that Elizabeth was a heretical usurper, he gathered around him a group of like-minded conspirators who plotted to assassinate Elizabeth and to coordinate a Spanish invasion of England. Babington wrote to Mary, informing her of the plot and seeking her approval. Mary, desperate for freedom and convinced that this was her last chance, responded to Babington, expressing her support for the plan. However, Babington's letters were intercepted by Walsingham, Elizabeth's spymaster, who had infiltrated the conspiracy with a network of double agents. Walsingham carefully monitored the plot, allowing it to unfold just far enough to gather irrefutable evidence of Mary's involvement. The intercepted letters were carefully deciphered and presented to Elizabeth. The letters clearly implicated Mary in a plot to assassinate her, providing the proof that Elizabeth needed to justify her execution. The discovery of the Babington plot sent shockwaves through England. Parliament demanded Mary's immediate execution, and Elizabeth, under immense pressure, finally agreed to put her on trial for treason. Mary was moved to Fotheringhay Castle, where she was to face her accusers. The atmosphere in the castle was grim and foreboding, the air thick with tension and apprehension. Mary knew that her fate was sealed, but she was determined to face her death with courage and dignity. The trial of Mary, Queen of Scots, was a sham, a preordained spectacle designed to legitimize her execution. She was denied legal representation, denied access to her papers, and denied the right to call witnesses in her defense. Despite the unfairness of the trial, Mary defended herself with eloquence and skill. She argued that she was a sovereign queen, not subject to English law, and that she had been unjustly imprisoned for years. She denied that she had ever plotted to kill Elizabeth, and claimed that the letters presented as evidence were forgeries. However, the outcome of the trial was never in doubt. The commissioners, handpicked by Elizabeth, found Mary guilty of treason and sentenced her to death. Elizabeth, however, hesitated to sign the death warrant. She was torn between her desire to eliminate a dangerous rival and her reluctance to execute a fellow queen. She feared the political consequences of such an act, both at home and abroad. For months, Elizabeth agonized over the decision, consulting with her advisors, seeking divine guidance, and weighing the pros and cons. She knew that signing the death warrant would be a momentous act, one that would forever stain her legacy. Finally, under immense pressure from Parliament and her advisors, Elizabeth succumbed. She signed the death warrant authorizing the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. The news of Mary's impending execution spread quickly throughout England and Scotland. Catholics mourned the loss of their queen, while Protestants rejoiced at the removal of a dangerous threat. Mary prepared for her death with remarkable composure and grace. She spent her final days in prayer, reflection, and writing letters to her friends and family. She accepted her fate with resignation, convinced that she was a martyr for her faith and a victim of injustice. On February 8, 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots, was led to the executioner's block at Fotheringhay Castle. She was dressed in a simple black gown, her head covered with a white veil. She walked with a steady step, her eyes fixed on the crucifix she held in her hand. Before placing her head on the block, Mary delivered a final speech, proclaiming her innocence and forgiving her enemies. She prayed for the salvation of her soul and for the restoration of the Catholic faith in England. With a single stroke of the axe, the executioner severed Mary's head from her body. The execution was witnessed by a large crowd of onlookers, who were deeply moved by the tragic spectacle. The death of Mary, Queen of Scots, sent shockwaves throughout Europe. Catholics condemned Elizabeth as a tyrant and a murderer, while Protestants praised her for ridding the world of a dangerous enemy. Mary's death did not, however, end the conflict between England and Scotland. Her son James initially protested his mother's execution but eventually reconciled with Elizabeth, recognizing that his best chance of inheriting the English throne lay in maintaining good relations with her. Upon Elizabeth's death in 1603, James succeeded her as King of England, uniting the crowns of England and Scotland. Mary's dream of a united British kingdom was finally realized, although she did not live to see it. The story of Mary, Queen of Scots, remains one of the most tragic and compelling in European history. She was a woman of great beauty, intelligence, and ambition, who was ultimately undone by the political intrigues and religious conflicts of her time. Was she guilty of the crimes she was accused of, or was she a victim of circumstance, a pawn in a larger game of power and ambition? The answer to that question remains elusive, shrouded in the mists of time and the biases of history. What is undeniable is that Mary, Queen of Scots, lived a life of extraordinary drama, and left behind a legacy that continues to fascinate and intrigue us to this day. The silence within Tutbury Castle was a heavier thing now, a blanket woven from suspicion and distrust. Mary no longer sang for pleasure. Her music was a calculated performance for eavesdropping ears. The letters smuggled in ale barrels tasted of iron and desperation, the ink blurring under the damp stone ceiling. The whispers from her remaining servants were clipped, fearful. A new jailer, Sir Amias Paulet, had arrived, a man of iron will and puritanical fervor, replacing the relatively lenient Sir Ralph Sadler. Paulet immediately curtailed her liberties, reducing her household and tightening security. Even the daily exercise in the castle courtyard was now conducted under the watchful eyes of armed guards. The Ridolfi plot, a grandiose scheme orchestrated by an Italian banker, Roberto di Ridolfi, to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the English throne, unfolded in the shadows. Mary, communicating through coded messages concealed in ale casks and the soles of shoes, cautiously endorsed the plan, hoping for liberation. However, Cecil's network of spies, ever vigilant, intercepted the correspondence. The Duke of Norfolk, implicated in the plot by his desire to marry Mary and seize power, was arrested and eventually executed, a chilling warning to any potential sympathizers. Mary vehemently denied any involvement, claiming the letters were forgeries fabricated by her enemies, but the evidence, circumstantial as it was, further cemented her reputation as a dangerous threat. The foiled plot resulted in stricter confinement. Her access to visitors was severely restricted, and her correspondence was meticulously scrutinized. The air grew thick with the sense of an approaching doom, a slow, suffocating closure. The tightening grip manifested in small, insidious ways. Her personal physician, a man she had trusted for years, was replaced with a Protestant doctor, Edmund Carey, sent by Elizabeth. Carey's presence was a constant reminder of her captivity, a symbol of the Queen's unwavering control over her body and her fate. The tapestries she had painstakingly embroidered depicting scenes from her past life were removed, deemed potential hiding places for secret messages. Her jewelry, symbols of her royal status, were confiscated, allegedly for safekeeping, but in reality, to diminish her prestige and isolate her further. Even the quality of her food declined. The once lavish meals replaced with simpler, blander fare. Each small act of deprivation was a calculated step towards breaking her spirit, towards reducing her from a queen to a mere pawn in a dangerous game. New regulations forbade her from speaking directly to anyone outside her immediate household without Paulet's permission. She was forced to dictate her letters to secretaries who were essentially government spies. The loyal servants who had remained with her through years of imprisonment were slowly replaced by individuals handpicked by Paulet, men and women whose allegiance lay solely with Elizabeth. The constant surveillance was maddening. She felt like a caged animal, pacing restlessly within the confines of her chambers, her every move observed, her every word recorded. The fear of betrayal permeated every aspect of her life. Who could she trust? Which of her servants was reporting back to Paulet? The paranoia gnawed at her, eroding her confidence and driving her further into isolation. The Throckmorton plot, another attempt to liberate Mary with the aid of Spanish forces, was quickly discovered and crushed by Walsingham's efficient spy network. Francis Throckmorton, a young Catholic nobleman, confessed under torture to conspiring with the Spanish ambassador to invade England and overthrow Elizabeth. Mary's alleged involvement was again based on intercepted correspondence, although the extent of her knowledge and participation remained unclear. The plot further intensified the anti-Catholic sentiment in England and hardened Elizabeth's resolve to deal with Mary once and for all. Parliament, fueled by fear and outrage, passed stricter laws against Catholics and pressed Elizabeth to take decisive action against the Scottish Queen. Mary's health began to deteriorate. Years of confinement, stress, and poor diet took their toll. She suffered from chronic pain, digestive problems, and bouts of depression. The damp, cold conditions of her various prisons exacerbated her physical ailments. She wrote increasingly desperate letters to Elizabeth, begging for better treatment and for permission to seek medical attention in France. Her pleas were ignored. Elizabeth, hardened by years of suspicion and political intrigue, saw only a manipulative and dangerous enemy. Each failed plot further eroded Mary's hope. The occasional visit from a sympathetic nobleman or clergyman became rarer, fraught with danger for both visitor and visited. The outside world seemed to be receding, becoming a distant memory. The Babington plot proved to be the final, fatal blow. Anthony Babington, a young Catholic nobleman, orchestrated a complex scheme to assassinate Elizabeth and free Mary. He corresponded with Mary through a secret channel, using coded messages delivered by a brewery worker. Walsingham's spies, however, had infiltrated the network and were intercepting and deciphering the letters. The letters, which explicitly discussed the assassination of Elizabeth, provided irrefutable evidence of Mary's involvement. Her secretaries, Gilbert Correll and Now, were arrested and interrogated. Under pressure, they confessed to having transcribed and translated the incriminating letters, further implicating Mary in the plot. The captured correspondence painted a damning picture. Babington outlined a detailed plan to murder Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne. Mary, in her replies, approved of the plan and offered suggestions. The letters were presented as undeniable proof of her treachery. The evidence was overwhelming, and Elizabeth could no longer ignore the calls for Mary's execution. The discovery of the Babington plot triggered a wave of anti-Catholic hysteria throughout England. Parliament demanded immediate action against Mary, and Elizabeth, facing intense pressure from her advisers and the public, reluctantly agreed to convene a commission to try her for treason. Mary was moved to Fotheringhay Castle, a bleak and isolated fortress in Northamptonshire. The trial was a foregone conclusion. She was denied access to legal counsel and refused to acknowledge the authority of the English court to judge her, an anointed queen. The prosecution presented the Babington letters as the cornerstone of their case. Mary vehemently denied any involvement in the assassination plot, claiming the letters were forgeries and that her secretaries had acted without her knowledge. She argued that she was a prisoner of war, not a subject of the English crown, and therefore could not be tried for treason. Her pleas fell on deaf ears. The commission, composed of loyal English nobles and officials, found her guilty of treason. The sentence was death. Elizabeth hesitated. The execution of a queen, even a foreign one, was a momentous decision with potentially far-reaching consequences. She feared the reaction of Catholic powers in Europe, particularly Spain and France. She worried about the precedent it would set for the treatment of monarchs. She also felt a strange sense of kinship with Mary, a fellow queen who had faced similar challenges and dangers. Elizabeth agonized over the decision for months, weighing the political risks against her own personal feelings. She consulted with her advisors, sought guidance from theologians, and prayed for divine intervention. The pressure from Parliament and her councillors was relentless. They argued that Mary's continued existence posed an intolerable threat to the security of England and the life of the Queen. They warned that if Elizabeth hesitated, she would be seen as weak and indecisive, emboldening her enemies and undermining her authority. Walsingham presented evidence of continued plots and conspiracies, all aimed at freeing Mary and overthrowing Elizabeth. He argued that as long as Mary lived, she would remain a focal point for rebellion and a source of instability. Cecil, with his usual pragmatism, stressed the importance of protecting England from foreign invasion and religious conflict. He warned that if Elizabeth showed mercy to Mary, she would be betraying her duty to her people. Leicester, driven by his own ambition and fear of a Catholic resurgence, urged Elizabeth to act decisively and without delay. He argued that Mary was a viper who would strike at any opportunity, and that the only way to ensure England's safety was to eliminate the threat completely. The letters arriving at court detailed increasingly desperate measures being planned in France and Spain. Rumors of a Spanish armada, poised to invade England and restore Catholicism, circulated widely. The public clamored for Mary's execution, seeing her as the embodiment of the Catholic threat. Elizabeth received countless petitions and letters demanding that she sign the death warrant. She was bombarded with pamphlets and sermons denouncing Mary as a traitor and a murderess. The atmosphere in England was charged with fear and suspicion. Elizabeth, trapped between her own conscience and the demands of state, vacillated. She signed the death warrant, then revoked it. She suggested that Paulet might find a way to relieve her of Mary without her direct involvement, a suggestion that Paulet, to his credit, refused to entertain. She offered to exile Mary to France or Scotland, but these options were deemed too risky. The political machinery of England, once set in motion, seemed to have a momentum of its own, dragging Elizabeth towards a decision she dreaded. The isolation of her position as queen became starkly apparent. The burden of choice, the weight of responsibility, pressed down on her with crushing force. She was surrounded by advisors, but ultimately, the decision was hers alone. Finally, after months of agonizing deliberation, Elizabeth signed the death warrant, entrusting it to her secretary, William Davison. She gave him strict instructions not to reveal it to anyone without her express permission. However, under pressure from the Privy Council, Davison disobeyed her orders and presented the warrant to Lord Burghley, who immediately convened the council and ordered the execution to proceed. Elizabeth, upon learning of Davison's actions, claimed that she had never intended for the warrant to be executed, and that she had been betrayed by her own councillors. She imprisoned Davison in the Tower of London, and publicly disavowed any responsibility for Mary's death. Whether this was genuine remorse or a calculated act of political self-preservation remains a matter of debate. The trap had closed. The consequences were irreversible. Mary, Queen of Scots, would die. Fotheringhay Castle loomed, a stark silhouette against the bleak winter sky. Within its stone walls, Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, found herself confined, her world reduced to the dimensions of her chambers. The air was thick with foreboding, each echoing footstep a harbinger of the inevitable. The relative comforts of her previous imprisonments were stripped away, replaced by a palpable sense of finality. The whispers that had once carried tales of hope now spoke only of trial and judgment. The arrival of the commissioners signaled the commencement of the end. 36 men, peers of the realm, privy councillors and judges, assembled to try Mary for treason against Queen Elizabeth. She stood before them, a queen stripped of her power, yet retaining a regal bearing that commanded a grudging respect. She refused to acknowledge the legitimacy of the court, arguing that as an anointed queen she was subject to no earthly jurisdiction. Her protests were met with cold indifference. The trial proceeded, a grim charade played out under the guise of justice. The evidence against Mary was damning. The letters seized from Babington and his co-conspirators, detailing a plot to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the English throne, were presented as irrefutable proof of her treasonous intent. Mary vehemently denied the authenticity of the letters, claiming they were forgeries concocted by her enemies. She argued that her secretaries, Now and Correll, had been coerced into confessing her involvement. Yet their testimonies, extracted under duress, painted a vivid picture of Mary's complicity in the plot. The trial stretched over 2 days, a relentless interrogation that chipped away at Mary's defenses. She fought back with eloquence and passion, appealing to the commissioners' sense of justice and reminding them of her royal blood. But her pleas fell on deaf ears. The verdict was preordained. On October 25, 1586, the commissioners delivered their judgment. Mary, Queen of Scots, was found guilty of treason. The news of the verdict reached Elizabeth, plunging her into a state of turmoil. She was torn between her duty to protect her realm and her reluctance to execute a fellow sovereign. The decision weighed heavily on her, a moral dilemma that haunted her waking hours. Parliament clamored for Mary's execution, viewing her as a constant threat to Elizabeth's life and the stability of the Protestant realm. Elizabeth stalled, prevaricated, and sought ways to avoid signing the death warrant. She feared the repercussions both at home and abroad. The execution of a queen, even one found guilty of treason, would set a dangerous precedent and invite the wrath of Catholic powers. Months passed in agonizing uncertainty. Elizabeth wrestled with her conscience, seeking counsel from her advisors but finding no easy answers. She considered various alternatives, including exile and stricter imprisonment, but none seemed to offer a satisfactory solution. The pressure from Parliament and the public continued to mount. They demanded swift and decisive action, arguing that Mary's continued existence posed an unacceptable risk. Finally, in February 1587, Elizabeth yielded. Faced with the overwhelming pressure and the perceived threat to her throne, she signed the death warrant. She did so reluctantly, with a heavy heart, but convinced that it was the only way to ensure the safety of her realm. The warrant was entrusted to William Davison, Elizabeth's secretary, with instructions to deliver it to Lord Burghley, the Lord Treasurer. However, Elizabeth also hinted that she might want Davison to withhold the warrant, leaving him in a state of confusion and uncertainty. Burghley, determined to see the execution carried out, convened a secret meeting of the Privy Council, who decided to send the warrant to Fotheringhay without further consulting Elizabeth. News of the signed warrant reached Fotheringhay Castle with chilling speed. Mary was informed of her impending execution. She received the news with remarkable composure, accepting her fate with a stoicism that surprised even her captors. She spent her final days in prayer and contemplation, preparing herself for the ultimate sacrifice, She wrote letters to her friends and allies, bidding them farewell and entrusting her son James to their care. On the morning of February 8, 1587, Mary rose early and dressed in her finest clothes. She wore a gown of black velvet, a symbol of mourning but also a statement of her royal dignity. She carried a crucifix and a rosary, emblems of her unwavering faith. She was led to the great hall of Fotheringhay Castle, which had been transformed into a makeshift execution chamber. A scaffold had been erected draped in black cloth. A crowd of witnesses, including nobles, officials, and curious onlookers, filled the hall. Mary mounted the scaffold with grace and courage. She addressed the assembled crowd, protesting her innocence and declaring that she died for her faith. She forgave her enemies and prayed for the salvation of her soul. The executioner approached, offering his apologies. Mary accepted them with a gentle smile. She removed her crucifix and rosary and handed them to her attendants. She then knelt before the block, placing her head upon it. The executioner raised his axe. A hush fell over the hall. With a swift, clean stroke, he severed Mary's head from her body. The execution was swift and brutal. The crowd gasped in horror. Some wept openly. Others stared in stunned silence. The executioner held up Mary's head, proclaiming, "God save Queen Elizabeth." The deed was done. Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, was dead. News of Mary's execution sent shockwaves throughout Europe. Catholic powers were outraged, condemning Elizabeth's act as a barbaric violation of royal prerogative. France and Spain threatened retaliation. Even in England there was widespread unease. Many questioned the legality and morality of executing a queen, regardless of the charges against her. Elizabeth, feigning ignorance and grief, blamed Davison for exceeding his authority. She had him arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London, using him as a scapegoat to deflect criticism. She sent ambassadors to France and Scotland to explain her actions and reassure them of her peaceful intentions. In Scotland, James VI, Mary's son, reacted with cautious diplomacy. While he publicly protested his mother's execution, he secretly welcomed the removal of a potential rival to the English throne. He continued to cultivate friendly relations with Elizabeth, recognizing that his best chance of succeeding her lay in maintaining her favor. Years later, after Elizabeth's death in 1603, James VI of Scotland ascended to the English throne, uniting the two kingdoms under his rule. Mary's long-held ambition, to see her line inherit the English crown, was finally realized, albeit posthumously. Mary's body was initially buried at Peterborough Cathedral. However, in 1612, James had her remains exhumed and reinterred in Westminster Abbey, placing her in a tomb befitting a queen. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, remains a controversial event in history. Some view her as a traitor who plotted against Elizabeth and threatened the stability of England. Others see her as a victim of circumstance, a pawn in a larger political game, and a martyr for her faith. Whatever the interpretation, Mary's story continues to fascinate and intrigue. Her life was filled with drama, intrigue, and tragedy. Her execution marked the end of an era and ushered in a new chapter in the history of England and Scotland. The axe fell. Silence.